Does anyone have a book or something I could lean? I left my thing. Actually, I could use my floss. Okay, don't worry. I've saved the day. Is it good? Hello? Is there anyone there? Okay. Where, do you think anyone else is going to come? Is it like the weather is nice?
Yeah, one other person I know can come.
Okay. Yeah. Like it started. I think it's that time in the semester, isn't it? Having this kind of spring break right before the end means the final bit of the semester. Maybe some people just went home and didn't come back. Or especially if they live, you know, at the seaside or somewhere like that. Yeah, it could happen. Or maybe the weather's just nice today. Yeah. Okay. So, shall I wait another minute? So, like, yeah, what I wanted to do, I wanted to finish off the article by Kerry. And then I wanted to move on to the Bayesian stuff, and there is a connection. So Kerry, in her book, this article is like a summary of the book. So if you find it interesting, you go and have a look at the book. And there's some really fun stuff in the book. There's some nice, very empirical work on discontinuities in conceptual schemes in the history of science. And she's got a very nice chapter where she looks at the emergence of the modern understanding and distinction between heat and temperature. And she compares the Renaissance view of heat and temperature to the kind of 3-year-old's view, the 3-year-old who can't solve the what's it called, the conservation tasks. They got sort of conceptual confusion similar to the confusion we found in the Renaissance in science. It's sort of nice. So her two big claims is that the first claim is that there are discontinuities in development. Yeah, it's very, when you're writing on a blackboard, it's really hard to spell. So then I just start writing really messily and no one notices. It's like if you're doing a logic exam, you can always do the kind of truth, you know, is it true or false? Oh, you can't have it, see, it's whatever's right. Yeah, yeah. So there are discontinuities in development. And what she means like this is she's committed to a form of representationalism. So if we're understanding psychology, the mind sort of represents things and there's some sort of representational format. And so to say there are discontinuities has got to do with the idea that later representational schemes have more expressive power than earlier ones. Now, I said representational schemes, much in conceptual schemes. Yeah.
Is there any difference between representation and concept in that context? Because it seems like concepts are somewhat specific kind of representations.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, when we're talking about representations and concepts, the word concept is a tricky one, and lots of people disagree. There's lots of arguments, for example, about whether animals have concepts. And often when you get these disagreements, sometimes you wonder, is there a real disagreement about anything substantial? Or is it just a disagreement about how to use words? And I tend to think that that people just use the word concept in various different ways. I think Carey is using it, tends to use it in a way that might suggest that many animals don't have concepts. So she thinks concepts are mental representation that can play a role in inference and argument, and maybe they're connected to language. She's not totally clear on where to draw the line. Yeah, but one thing she does say, so if you look at, she looks at these three examples, and the first one is what she calls the relatively easy route to new conceptual primitives. Sorry, the first one is the relatively easy route to new representational primitives. And these are sort of domain-specific learning mechanisms. So priming, the way these buntings come to represent which direction is north, yeah, from the stars. And these are representations. Then she talks about these conceptual primitives, and she says that, well, where's the quote? I can't find the quote. But I think one of the things about concepts is that they can play a role in inferences. Yeah, and now there's lots of disagreement. So there's a big literature in philosophy about concept and conceptual capacities. And there's sort of one group who think conceptual capacities are quite difficult and go together with rationality. So only beings that are sort of rational possess concepts. And conceptual possession is tied to rationality, and it's tied to the capacity to make inferences in a sort of general way. And once you've got a concept, it can be the domain it can be applied to is very general. Yeah, when something's in the conceptual space, you can compare it to concepts. Whereas some of these kind of representational things we find in animals are very domain specific. They represent north, and then the only role this representation can play is guiding navigation. It's not able to play these other roles, and it's not able to relate in a sort of open way with all the other representations. So some people like Gareth Evans, for example, thinks that concepts, there's what he calls the generality constraint, that concepts are able to be put together in a sort of general way, whereas pre-conceptual, non-conceptual representations are. Now, I think that as a philosopher, I think when it comes to questions about the distinction between representations and concepts, the way to solve this is just stipulative. So, stipulative definitions. Yeah, you just tell the reader, this is how I'm going to use the word concept. Yeah, I think that if you're working in this area and you're talking about concepts and representation, and there's some distinction you want to draw, I think at some point you just sort of stipulate. You have to say, this is how I'm using the word. Yeah. Maybe you give an operational definition. I don't know. Yeah. But you just tell the reader how you're going to use it. And as long as you're kind of consistent in your use, and your use isn't crazy, like you can't say, oh, the word concept, the way I use it, it means cheese. Yeah. Like no, stipulation can't go that far. But you've got a broad range of what people think about concepts. You've got some use of the word, and then you just got to stipulate. And I think this is what she basically does. And also, I think she's not that concerned about the boundary issue. Yeah, like, well, do chimpanzees have concepts? Do ants? Do bees? Do bacteria? At some point you're going to say no, and at some point you're going to say yes. And then there's a bunch of messy stuff in the middle. But yeah, I think she thinks that concepts are a sort of species of representation. And so she talks about these representations that maybe are non-conceptual. This is the first time she looks at. And then concepts are things that can play a role in inferences. They're connected to rationality. You might think only, maybe they form parts of beliefs. I don't know, like if you think rational thought involves propositional attitude, you might think concepts are somehow things that can be elements within propositions. I think this is problematic because I've got no idea what a proposition is. I've got a better idea what was one of my friends said, a logic jug. I was trying to think, what's the difference between a proposition, a statement, and a sentence? So the paedophile made a proposition to the young boy. He then made a statement to the police, and then the judge passed sentence on him. Yeah, so we have the word proposition, statement, sentence. And people often think that beliefs and desires are sort of propositional attitude, that they've got some, and a proposition, you might think is something like the meaning of a sentence. A statement, or you have an utterance as well. An utterance is a particular act. A statement, what's that? I mean, philosophers try and make distinctions between all of these. A proposition, propositions are supposed to play two roles. They're supposed to be the meaning of sentences. Yeah, but then they're also supposed to be the contents of beliefs. Yeah. Yeah, so you have a sort of, you have a belief, and the belief has a content that can be expressed by a sentence. And then I take it kind of one view of concepts, the sort of old school view of concepts, is that concepts then are things that can play a role as sort of constituents of beliefs in some sense. And then the question is how is that supposed to work? But anyway, yeah, so the first claim she's committed to is that there are these discontinuities in development. And the sort of idea here is that later conceptual schemes have more expressive power than earlier ones. So what does that mean? What does she mean by saying later representational conceptual schemes have more expressive power than earlier ones? So like there's the mental language of the 3-year-old and the mental language of the 5-year-old. And there's things that the 5-year-old can possibly think that can be thought using that language that can't be thought using the language of the 3-year-old. Yeah. So there are contents that are thinkable using. So we could think of the conceptual scheme as a sort of vocabulary. One way, yeah. We can think that there are things that can be thought using the later vocabulary that can't be thought using the previous vocabulary, where the vocabulary is a sort of vocabulary of thought, sort of mental vocabulary. Yeah. And this is something that many, I think the standard view has been to deny this. So there's a background assumption that there is continuity. And the continuity view is that all later thoughts can be in some sense constructed out of this primitive vocabulary. So you start off with a primitive innate sort of vocabulary. It may be a vocabulary of, say, sense data. And then all of your later concepts can somehow be constructed out of this primitive vocabulary with maybe the tools of logic. So that our later concepts are, in some sense, logical constructs out of something more primitive. You might think if you've read Carnap, the Aufbau, this is the sort of picture you get there. And I think many people in psychology have implicitly brought in something like that. There's this sort of hidden influence of philosophy laying in the background. So first thing she wants to say is there are real discontinuities. This means that our adult concepts are not, Not all of our adult concepts are logically constructed out of earlier concepts. The sort of empiricist version of this is all about concepts have to be logically constructed out of something like sense data. So one version of the continuity thesis is a kind of strong empiricism that says all of our concepts, all of our meaningful concepts are somehow logically constructible out of sensible primitives. We have what's given to us in experience. And then all of our, any concept that has to be meaningful is somehow going to be tied to experience by being kind of logically definable in terms of stuff that's experienceable. Yeah, so this is philosophically, I think this is a kind of quite strong, I think she's obviously right. I think there's a very strong tendency for people to kind of go the other way. And the second thing is there's a view, so it's not the case that all learning is hypothesis testing. Yeah. And once again, there's a sort of view that's quite common, both in psychology and philosophy, and in philosophy of cognitive science, that thinks all learning is hypothesis testing. Yeah. And if all learning is hypothesis testing, in some sense, a hypothesis space has to be given prior to the learning experience. Yeah, so you have a sort of hypothesis space where you have a sort of representation of all the possibilities, and then learning is deciding which of the possibilities is true, which seems to suggest that we sort of have to start off representing the hypothesis space. Yeah, so there's no conception. These two things are sort of tied together. Yeah, and I think she wants to reject. I mean, she's committed to both of these. There are discontinuities, and they're not all learning is hypothesis testing. Oops, hold on. Hello, okay. Can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah, you can hear me, yeah? I can see a micro. Oh, yeah, someone else has got their microphone turned off. I thought I may have had my microphone turned off. Okay. Yeah, so she looks at 3 examples. There are 3 types of cases, and we talked about 2 of them online, but a lot of people weren't. Who was in class yesterday? Okay, yeah, so half of you were. So what I'm doing now is I'm sort of repeating what I did yesterday, but I think repetition is not a bad thing. Just, you hear it once, and especially on Zoom, it's difficult to take stuff in. So just running through it, I think it's a bit easier like this. So what are the 3 examples? So we have domain-specific learning mechanisms. For new representational this is on page, starting on page 423. We have domain specific, we have, we have the object kind concept learning mechanisms. And then we have Quinian bootstrapping. So there are 3 classes there are 3 types of learning that, in some sense, she thinks rejects both of these. Yeah? And in class yesterday, we talked about online. I talked about this one and this one. What's an example of the domain-specific learning mechanism?
Getting more studying.
Yeah, what are they called? They're buntings. What sort of bunting are they? if I was a psychologist, I'd be able to say, you know, they're indigo buntings, blah, 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 1986, and give all the quotes. I can't do that. What sort of, oh, they are indigo buntings, yeah. So I got the indigo buntings, but there's Steve Emlen did this thing where buntings, they're birds, they need to fly south in the winter and fly north in the summer. And in order to do that, they need to know which direction north is. It's not innate. They do it by navigating using the stars. How do they know which star is north? Now, because the axis of spin changes over time, this is not something every 30,000 years, it changes quite radically. It's not something that they've got an innate star map. So they learn by seeing what is the point around which all the stars rotate at night. Yeah, so north, if you just sit there and just kind of watch, and you do a fast, yeah, you'll see all the stars rotating around a particular point. And that's basically where north is. And at the moment, there's a star, which we call the North Star. Is it the pole star? Which we call it Polaris, is it? What's the star? So that really bright. What? Yeah, and it's the North Star. So if you aim at that star, you make north. The problem is, in 30,000 years, it won't be that, it'll be somewhere else. Yeah, and so these buntings acquire a representation. They learn a representation of north. They've got this sort of learning mechanism. It seems to be the learning mechanism is hardwired. So look at in the early years, in the early days, they look at the stars and they work out what the center of rotation is, and then they kind of store that and they create this representation of north through this dedicated learning mechanism. Now, and you discover this, the guy discovered this by bringing up buntings in a planetarium, and just choosing random bits of the night sky, just yeah, and then if you bring them up in a planetarium, instead of the star map rotating around Polaris, it rotates around another star. That's the direction they'll head when they want to head north. Yeah, so and this seems clearly a type of learning that is not hypothesis testing. And this sort of learning seems to be quite ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. And she thinks that this is the development of a new representational primitive. It's not obvious to me that that's the case, because you might think they already have. They have a representation of an innate representation of the direction I should head when it gets hot, when it gets cold. Yeah. And then what they really, so you might think they never end up with the representation of north, they've just got a representation of where they should head when it gets cold. Yeah, so when the temperatures, when it gets warm, they head north when it gets, yeah, in summer. And so it's not obvious to me that this is a real case of learning a new representational primitive. Because what they do is they just learn to associate this with a particular point in the sky. It's not, I mean, I think their argument, I think this is enough. Once you go through and think about it and work through it, I'm not convinced that you have to understand this in terms of the acquisition of a new representation. But it does seem to be clearly a case of learning that is hypothesis testing. Yeah. So that's the sort of idea. The second type of learning is the sort of Milligan stuff. Yeah, so the stuff we looked at with Milligan, I think Carey's view is basically a version of Milligan's view. Milligan has been pushing this, something like this, since the sort of 80s, and a bunch of philosophers have, coming out of the work of Putnam and Tripke on on names and kind terms. Yeah, and we sort of talked about this. That we go out there and, okay, so the concept kangaroo. This is not innate. The Europeans, before the discovery of Australia, weren't capable of forming the concept of kangaroo. Because the concept of kangaroo is the concept of animals like that one. Yeah, you've got kind of you've got, and in order to form the concept of kangaroo, you've got to meet a kangaroo. Yeah, and then you've got a concept of animals of the same kind as that one. Yeah, so that and we're capable of forming all sorts of object kind concepts. I think we're also capable of forming concepts of individuals. You might think that, and these aren't innate. You can only really form a concept of an individual if you've met the individual, or you've met someone who's met the individual. Yes, having a concept of an individual is also something. And I take it the idea here is that these object kind learning mechanisms, you end up with concepts that have a kind of externalist context. That they can't be defined. I mean, you can't give a definition of the concept. What the concept refers to depends upon stuff external to the mind, depends upon the way the world is. So what the concept kangaroo refers to depends on kind of facts about evolutionary history, which animals are related to each other, what animals are of the same kind. So these object kind concepts are concepts that don't have a definition. Their reference, their extension, what they refer to is determined by external features in the world. And so this is something that basically, I don't want to say much about this, but what Milligan calls substance concepts, I take this is what Kerry's talking about here. One thing is that, was that question? Like burning books? Welcome. I think there's some structural. Yeah, okay. What do you think? It's not that bad at the moment, is it?
I just wouldn't rate that.
What do you think? Should we? How close are we to the break? I think they're just doing some work, and it just smells like. What time is it now? Okay. Yeah. So this is stuff that if you read the Milligan, you can be surprised about. But we're able to form concepts of species and these are things that we can't define in terms of our own concepts because they don't have definition. Yeah? This is the idea. Like the fact that they don't have definitions means that they can't be defined in terms of sort of more basic sensory qualities. What they refer to is it's at least partially determined by the way the world is. Now, there might be some schemas, so we might kind of we have object kind concepts. We also have kind of individual concepts of individuals. And these, you know, we have proper names. I think proper names are also the kind terms of proper names, according to this externalist view, function in sort of a similar way. And you only acquire a proper name if you meet someone, or if you met someone who's met someone. Yeah, so proper names are not definable. Yeah, like you can't, you know, that you can use a definition to pick out an individual in a context, but that sort of definite description is not a definition of the individual. Yeah, so you can say, oh, the Englishman is in the room. That's Lucas. Yeah, but the Englishman in the room doesn't define me. It's just that in this context, it's good enough to pick out a unique individual. In another context, maybe it isn't. If you're in a pub in London, yeah, it's like the Englishman in the room is Lucas. You're like, hold on, that doesn't help. Yeah. So individuals can't be defined. They can be. We can use descriptions to pick out individuals. We can use different descriptions. Different descriptions may be useful in different contexts. Sometimes the description can be false, and it can still adequately pick out an individual. But there's a famous case by, do people know Donnellan? You know the Donnellan case? And one thing about paucity is you don't do the philosophy of language. There's a classic paper by this guy called Donnellan. So I can refer to someone as the man in the corner drinking the martini. So there's this guy there with a martini glass, drinking away at the martini glass. And it's quite nice, isn't it? What? Yeah, so we might smell this. Sorry, we might smell this. It's really horrible, isn't it? It's like burning rubber. What? Anyone else getting it? Anyway, the Donnellan gives this example, the guy in the corner drinking the martini. And that's good enough to pick out an individual, even though it might turn out that the guy is teetotal and he's just drinking water from a martini glass. Yeah, so that we can use descriptions to pick out individuals, but the descriptions don't define the individual. Once we pick someone else, we point it to them, we form a concept of them. Yeah, so concepts of kinds, natural kinds, artificial kinds, and concepts of individuals are going to be concepts that we can acquire. And once we've got them, there are things we can say that we couldn't say before. Yeah, you know, until I've got the concept units, I can't say things about units. But once I've got it, I can. So there are things you can say when you've got this concept that you couldn't say before. Once you've learned some names. And also that when it comes to these sort of concepts, not all learning is hypothesis testing. So this is something that Milligan sort of stresses, I think Kerry is going to buy into, is that these sort of object kinds have this rich inductive potential. And that on a single encounter with an object, you can store information that's going to be usable, likely to be usable in a future encounter. So, for example, you meet a cat for the first time, you form the concept cat, you see the cat drinking milk, and you're sort of like, well, you store the information cat's drinking milk. So next time you meet a cat that seems hungry, you think, oh, I'll give it some milk. Yeah. Now, learning information like that doesn't seem to be a matter of hypothesis testing. Yeah. You meet Lucas for the first time. You're told this is Lucas. In some sense, learn the name. You've got some internal representation of Lucas that's associated with the name. And you sort of store information. So one bit of information you store is that Lucas speaks English. And next time you meet me, you speak English. Now, learning the information that Lucas speaks English, okay, that doesn't really seem like hypothesis testing. Yeah, you meet Lucas, he's speaking English, and you just store the information. Yeah, so learning names, you have more expressive power. You've got a type of learning that isn't hypothesis testing. Yeah, and the sort of thought is that object kinds Now, object kind terms are basically names. They work in the same way as names of individuals. Yeah, this is the sort of Kripke-Putnam view of natural kind. Now, the third way the third type of case she does is what she thinks is the most difficult, which is what she calls Quinean bootstrapping. Now, did anyone read this section? Did you understand it? No? Yeah. I think lots of people read her and didn't understand it. And this is her attempt to make it more understandable.
It has something to do with logical interpretation.
Yeah, well, so this is the relatively hard route to new conceptual primitives. So the example she gives is of numbers. Yeah, so we have this Quinean bootstrapping. Yeah, so the 8-year-old understands numbers, understands the numerals. What about infants and young children? What about infants and young children? Do they have any understanding of numbers? Well, anyone looked at anything on number cognition? It's something I've read a lot about. A couple of my friends work on this, and we organised some talks last year with them. They just had an article came out in Behavioural and Brain Sciences like last year on a target article on. They gave a kind of version of that before it came out last year. Jacob Beck, what's his name called? Anyway, yeah, and there's a nice, if anyone's interested in number cognition, there's Gehani, how you spell his name, has a book called The Number Sense. Yeah, which is a sort of classic. It's like one of the leading French cognitive scientists, neuroscientists. And this book I think is quite fun, it's quite readable, sort of beach book. If you like reading cognitive science on the beach, thinking about numbers on the beach. Yeah, I don't know. People do. So infants and children, it turns out, do have some sort of understanding of number. Yeah, and there are these two systems. First of all, that there's a basic understanding of sets of size 1, sets of size 2, and sets of size 3. Yeah, so we can. And maybe 4. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. So we can distinguish between 1, 2, and 3. 1 thing, 2 things, and 3 things. You may even think that these are sort of the concepts of a singleton, a pair, and a triple. You might think are innate. Yeah, so we have a concept of a set of size 1, a set of size 2, and a set of size 3. Yeah, and this is sort of accurate. And then we also, when it comes to larger sets, we have what many people think of as a sort of analog number representation. Yeah, so we can tell that there are more in this one than this one. Yeah, I think there's 10 here and there's 20 dots here. So we can 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah. So we can see that this set is bigger than this set. Yeah. And that when it comes to this, that it's the proportion difference. If one set is twice as big as another, we could normally see this just by looking. Yeah. If you've got one set that has 19 dots in and another set that has 20 dots in, they sort of look the same. We can't really see them apart. Maybe we can tell apart, 16 and 20. Probably not. 14 and 20. There's a sort of limit. And if we can kind of distinguish between 10 and 20, then we can also distinguish between 20 and 40. Yeah, it's sort of, I think this is Weber's law. If the ratio remains the same, we can distinguish. This is a sort of indication people think that the representation is a sort of analog representation. So we have some sort of analog representation of numerosity, yeah, that allows us to estimate which sort of set is bigger. And this seems to be something that many of us have. And it seems to be something that's really useful. Yeah? So if you're a chimpanzee and there's two trees with fruit on, you see the fruit, which tree do you go to? You want to go to the tree with more fruit. So if there's sort of, if there's 20 bananas on one tree and 10 on the other, you can just see by looking that there's more bananas on the first tree. If there's 20 on one and 18 on the other, the chimp is going to be like, he's going to choose randomly. But if they're given a choice between 20 and 10, they choose 20. This is the sort of idea. And then, depending on how good they are, maybe they can tell the difference between 12 and 20. If they can tell the difference between 12 and 20, then they're going to be able to tell the difference between 24 and 40. Now, does the ape have the concept 20? Well, the sort of thought is no. They don't have a representation of 20, because to have a representation of 20, you have to kind of be able to distinguish it from 19 and 21. Yeah, that 20 take away 1 is 19. If you add 1, you've got something that is 1 greater. If you've got 20 and you add 1, it doesn't look any different from 20. 20 and 21 sort of look the same, Richard. Yeah, so you might think having a representation of 20 as a numeral involves the capacity to distinguish between 20 and 21. So the chimps and babies can recognize sets accurately of numerosity 1, 2, and 3. In many languages, you have singular, plural, and dual. So seeing 2 people. That's something that really, and there's lots of experiments with babies where you kind of have, you show 3 things hidden, and then you kind of pull it away, and there's only 2 things there, and the baby's surprised. If you've got 1 thing hidden and you open it up and there's 2, the baby's surprised. If there's 4 things hidden or 5 things hidden, and you put it away and there's 4, the baby's just like, yeah, same old shit. Yeah. Yeah. If there's 4 and then you show 2, the baby's like, it's fine. Oh, what's wrong with you? Yeah. So the babies can distinguish. The sort of evidence for this has got to do with hiding things and whether the baby's surprised by. Now, you might question this sort of methodology, but that's the sort of picture. So how do we acquire our adult concepts of number? What are our adult concepts of number? Any thoughts? So he says this Quinian bootstrapping. Let me read this. This Quinian bootstrapping. So this it differs from those learning mechanisms described above, in that it did not arise through natural selection to acquire representation of sort. So it's something that's not going to be explained in terms of natural selection. We haven't got a natural mechanism for number learning. as we do for object lines and names, it creates new conceptual roles. So this new learning numbers, learning the concept of, so the 7-year-old has the concept of 10, and a 3-year-old doesn't. So we've got the concept 7. And this is a new concept, and it's not acquired through hypothesis testing. How do we get the concept 7? How do we acquire? How does a child acquire the concept 7? Well, to acquire the concept 7 involves creating a new conceptual role, rather than merely creating new primitives for which there were prepared conceptual roles. That's in the case of object kind. An object kind, once you've got it, you know what sort of role you can play. But with numbers, you've created something with a new conceptual role that didn't exist before. Yeah. And once created, these new conceptual roles provide constraints on the concepts that will be learned, just as in the relatively easy route to new conceptual primitives. So, so we have this, what she calls Quinean bootstrapping. She says, before the bootstrapping episode, the child has no manifest concepts for natural numbers. And the process of constructing the first representation of new primitive concepts, those are a subset of natural numbers, is not exhausted by defining them in terms of primitives and acidity available. So how do we get there? Well, I'm trying to find the sentence. So we basically, the child basically learns 7 by first of all learning a meaningless ordered list. Yeah, so the child just has the capacity to memorize an ordered list. So this is the capacity children have. So one sort of list is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Yeah. And you just teach the child to remember things in the right order. So you teach them to remember a list that has a certain order. And when and similarly, you teach them another list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So you teach them a language, a set of external symbols, and they remember that these symbols come in a certain order. And learning this ordered list is not in itself to learn the numbers. Yeah, that just learning to say a list of words in a particular order isn't to understand what numbers are. Yeah. There's some further step. You've got to realize that somehow you've already got the concepts of 1 and 2 and 3. So first of all, you sort of learn to correlate this word with singletons, this word with double pairs, this word with triples. Yeah. And then you come to learn that kind of moving 1 forward in the random list is correlated with adding 1 to the set. Yeah. And basically, and this is why there's a sort of bootstrap, because you start off by learning a sort of uninterpreted bit of language. Yeah, so learning numbers is fully dependent on something external to the mind, which is an external symbol system. And first of all, you've got an external symbol system, and there are certain rules that govern the symbol system. The rules that govern the symbol system is the ordering of symbols. Yeah.
Why do you think it's self-evident that 1, 2, and 3 is innate? Like,
so
I thought that the child may have the concept of 1 and then addition. And
yeah. So I mean, if you're interested, read the number sets by De Honey. He basically gives lots of arguments for it, and lots of he appeals to lots of. But I take it this sort of idea, and I think his sort of suggestion as well is that this has got to do with. There's another paradigm called moving object tracking, developed by Pishlin. And so, for example, if there's a bunch of things moving, a couple of them flash. Yeah, so suppose you've got 20 things and a couple of them flash, and then you have to track the ones that flash, and then at the end of the experiment, you point them out. It seems that there's a sort of limit on the number of things we can track simultaneously. And we might think that it looks like the limit is going to be something like 3 or maybe 4 objects. Yeah, and and so the sort of suggestion is that this capacity and the capacity to represent 1, 2, and 3 are underwritten by the same sort of mechanisms. So we're able to keep track of one thing, we're able to keep track of pairs, and we're able to keep track of triples. Yeah, and then that's about it. Yeah, and so we might think that keeping track of, if we keep track of one thing and then it goes behind the screen of 2 things here, hold on a minute, we're sort of confused. Yeah, and so we are able, we have this innate capacity to distinguish between sets of things, sets of cardinality 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, now you might say, hold on a minute, I thought you were saying that the numbers were innate. What you're saying now is we've got a capacity to distinguish between kind of these different types of sets. But the idea is, I take it the idea is that we have these random lists. And children don't like learning random lists in order. Yeah. And so having an ordered list is quite different from having a number list. And so having numbers are numerals of things that have an order. But learning mathematics, learning arithmetic, first of all, numbers have an order. We have the +1 operator, and we know the order of the numbers and how they sort of relate to each other. So you've got a sort of set of things that are governed by rules. But then at the same time, they pick out different sets in the world. Yeah, so you could learn all the stuff about the relationships between the numbers without realizing that they had anything to do without being able to apply them to objects in the world. Yeah, so learning the numbers involves, and then the sort of idea is that if we're tracking one thing, if we're tracking a pair of objects, so we've got tracking a single thing, tracking a pair, and tracking a triple. Yeah, the sort of idea is the first 3 numbers are quite easy. Yeah, and one sort of thing is it turns out that the kids learn 1, 2, and 3, and then anything above 3 is all the same. Yeah, so all the other numbers, they realize that the other numbers refer to something bigger than 3, but all the other numbers are sort of equal. So you show them 5 things, they could say any of, I'll just choose a random larger number. So everything above 3 just means bigger than 3. And then the kids are like, oh, hold on. We've got 4, but then everything bigger than 4. Yeah, so there are these stages kids go through. They get 1, 2, 3, and then you get 4 numbers who are able to use 4 properly. But then anything bigger than 4, they know these numbers. All of the numbers here, all the numerals here just need bigger than 4. Then you get 5 knowers and 6 knowers. And then at some point they're like, oh, you can just carry on doing this. Yeah. So the sort of idea with Quinian bootstrapping is that we can acquire new conceptual resources through sort of creating external structures. And we've got external objects, these sort of symbols. And then you've got rules that govern the symbols, the symbol system. And then in some sense, we can internalize the symbol system. Yeah. So we we start off with a series of symbols and the rules that govern them that is uninterpreted. Yeah, so we have a kind of meaningless ordered list. Yeah, so learning to count, learning the numbers, first of all involves learning to memorize a meaningless list. But this meaningless list has rules that govern its construction. There's a rule about how it's ordered. Yeah, that's cool. Because once you've got that, you've got a sort of rule governed list. But it's still meaningless. It's just a bit of, it's just like a nursery rhyme. It's just, you know, it's like a nonsense series of words the child just enjoys because they enjoy learning nonsense. So it takes some time then for them to interpret this particular. But once they've interpreted the external signal system, they end up with a set of concepts that they didn't have before. So talking about this sort of expressive power, like a chimpanzee can't say, I thought there were 7, but actually there were 8. That's just not, that's a thought that isn't even expressible given the conceptual resources of a chimpanzee. That's a thought that's only expressible given the development of a number concept. Yeah. A number concept, once again, it's a sort of externalist sort of view. Numbers concepts are acquired by first of all creating some sort of external resource in language. Yeah, and then it starts off as uninterpreted, and then we interpret it. So these numerical concepts are not part of the child's innate endowment, and they arise only after the bootstrapping episode in which the numeral list representation of numbers is constructed. Yeah, so she talked about core cognition of numbers. Yeah, so core cognition is this and this, the analog representation of numerosity, plus the capacity to distinguish between singletons, pairs, and triples, which seems to be connected to this sort of occasional stuff. There's a sort of short-term memory buffer that maybe can hold 3 things. Yeah, that can keep track of 3 things, up to 3 things at once. It looks like we may be able to do this more than once. So we might, yeah, we might be able to keep track of a set of 3 and a set of 2. But yeah, so we have the verbal numeral list. This is on page 433. Yeah, so the first explicit representation system that represents even a finite subset of positive integers is the verbal numeral list embedded in a count routine. So the child learns a count routine that doesn't have any meaning. They just learn the order. Yeah, it's just memorization. There's a counting principle, and these verbal numerals implicitly implement the successor function, at least with respect to the child's finite count list. For any numeral that represents cardinal value n, the next numeral in the list represents n plus 1. So there's a sort of correlation between this meaningless routine and set sizes. Moving one, the child has to kind of get by induction, moving once forward in the count routine means you add 1 more to the set. Yeah, this is the trick. So this is yeah, so she says, yeah, American middle class children learn to recite the count list and carry out the count routine in response to the probe how many shortly after their 2nd birthday. They do not learn how counting represents numbers for another 1.5 to 2 years. Young 2-year-olds first assign cardinal meanings to 1, treating other numerals as equivalent plural markers that contrast in meaning with 1. So 1 means 1, 2, 3, 4 just means many. All the other numbers just mean many. Treating other numerals as equivalent plural markers that contrast in meaning with 1. Some 7 to 9 months later, they assign cardinal meaning to 2, but still take all other numerals to be essentially the same as sum, contrasting only with 1 and 2. Then they work out the cardinal meaning of 3, then 4. And this protracted period of development is known as the subset node state. So you get 2 numbers. So the people who work on number concept development talk of a child as a kind of 2-knower and a 3-knower. So a 3-knower knows how to distinguish 1, 2, 3, and 4, but thinks any number above 4 just is made. This is, yeah. So that's basically the story she tells about these concepts. Three different ways to acquire concepts where we get discontinuities in terms of representational resources. Plus, they're all cases where we've got learning that isn't hypothesis testing. And yeah, and I think this is sort of right. If you're going to buy, at least if you're going to buy into any sort of representational view of the mind, you're going to have buy any sort of representationalist thinking of what's going on, then yeah, it seems clear that there are discontinuities. Yeah, and these discontinuities involve the capacity for new representations. And going along with this is the idea that novel learning is best thought of as hypothesis testing. Okay, let's have a break. After the break, if you've got any questions about this, you can ask me. Otherwise, we'll start talking about Bayesian fundamentalism. These are the Bayesians in sort of balaclavas, you know, the Bayesian fundamentalists with Kalashnikovs. Yeah, sure. A long time ago, yeah.
There was a chapter called the twins, who had like a very large number sense. I think like they could recognize that the number, I think, had like there are elements of something immediately, like every can like or 3 but their immediate number sense was much larger than ordinary people. So this kind of reminded me.
Oh, really? I can't remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think chapter is called the twins. This is a short chapter.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of weird people. So I think the idea is most people can, yeah, and then you know, in later development, we still keep this analog number representation. So we're able to estimate numbers like cardinalities by sight, and then we can roughly kind of match them to numbers, so we can see, you know, how many. Do you have this in fairs where you've got something with a bunch of sweets in and you've got to guess how many there are in there, and the one who guesses right wins it? Yeah, we're kind of not so bad at doing that. Like if you take the wisdom of crowds, if everyone guesses, the average is fairly close to the actual number. Yeah. So,
I'm guessing the time that does it.
So this sort of stuff on number sense, that a lot of people think that we've got the same thing in timing. Yeah, so how many, you know, you have to wait for a certain number of seconds and you have to estimate timing. So one popular view is that these tasks draw on the same sort of resources of this analog. So we've got some capacity for analog magnitude representation that we use for numbers. Now, one thing about these timing estimations is I think there's going to be a big difference for different types of durations. So like estimates there are some estimates that are going on at the conscious level. Well, I don't know, like stuff at the level of milliseconds. It seems to me that's probably going on at quite a low level. Whereas stuff, if we're asked to kind of stuff at the level of seconds, it seems to me there that perhaps then we are using the same mechanism as estimating magnitude. But yeah, so I think I can't remember if it's the Dahani book, but I think he also talks about the way in which, yeah, it's a fun one if you're interested in numbers. And it's quite readable. I'd recommend the second edition because there's a first edition, and the second edition is more up to date. And he does some interesting things about how there are various types of brain damage that lead to various types of dissociation. So you can have a brain damage that. So he's got another book on reading, and I think that's quite interesting because reading is obviously something that we haven't evolved to read, but it's too short. So we've got this, but we learn to read. And so one thing is there can be damage to the brain that can affect our capacity to read letters, but keep number reading intact. But we can have number reading damage, but our capacity to read non-numerals is fine. So it looks like when it comes to reading numbers and reading texts, that there are sort of different bits of the brain that are doing that. Yeah, it's a sort of interesting topic.
I was gonna ask you if you could upload the recordings.
Oh yeah, I will do that. Yeah,
because I had to miss.
There are lots of people were missing. I need to upload it for the other class as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Send you an email.
Oh, about what? Oh, okay. I replied. I went to India, so maybe I thought I'd replied to it, but maybe I planned to reply to it and then didn't, but then remembered the plan and thought I'd acted on the plan. Yeah. So that's okay by me. How's your computing class going?
I think I'm going to.
Okay. No, because I heard you were trying to withdraw and then that wasn't allowed. But you think you found a way that you can pass it?
Yes. I got some help from friends.
Okay.
And I got some good scores.
Yeah.
On quizzes.
Yeah.
And
okay. So you just need to pass it, yeah?
Yes. This is okay, right?
Okay. No, because I remember that you wanted to withdraw and then it was like, yeah, there's nothing we can do. The rules are outside of our control. So yeah, everyone in the remedial year needs to pass that class. Yeah. So that's cool now.
Yeah. I mean, there's still a possibility that maybe I failed. But
yeah.
Probably I won't.
Okay.
I'm still studying.
Yeah. And I think actually it's one of those classes where it's a good thing to have done.
I mean, I believe that I kind of know how to compute, how to program some basic stuff. But the class is a bit difficult. In terms of, in comparison with other classes at that level.
Yeah, why? Does it presuppose a bunch of calculus?
No, actually. The questions in exams they asked actually aren't much about programming.
Okay.
You know, they try to test whether you are good at analytic problem solving or not.
Yeah.
And I think that I might be that good. In the tasks when compared with other engineers.
Yeah.
But the practice, I kind of started to learn how they think we can solve this stuff.
Okay, that's good.
I expected something, this is formal, this is wild, and you can use those kind of stuff to do that or that.
it wasn't so much hands-on writing programs. It's more of the theory.
Actually, I was expecting. No, it's not about theory. It's very more hands-on than I expected.
Oh, okay.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Biz niye güzel olduğunu ya? Ayrıca şey, işte galiba, ben şimdi yavaş Yanların içine gelmiyor. Zaten ben istiyorum. Canım öyle orada biz en olmadı yazın burada olanlarla falan bakmışlar. Tamam değil. Öyle 4 tane sanatım var aslında ben de işime geliyor. Final mi yoksa normal ödev mi? Gerçi bir tanesi açık ödev olacak. Kendi alanı az ders olacak. O yüzden o kadar problem değil. Şu GPA'ye bağlamam lazım. Aslında bayağı %100 aldım. Sen yıldan 95 falan aldım. Toparladı. Yani şimdi finalden 40 alsam geçiyorum falan gibi. Dolayısıyla ama ekstra konu gelecek mi gelmeyecek o biraz biliriz. Ben de biraz bilirsiniz. Dediğim gibi ya. Bir o var yani anksiyeteye sokabilecek, kaygılanabileceğim şey. Bir kalan zaten deadline'ların ucu yani size çıktığım bir şey. Ben son okuyorum dedi. Hafta sonuna kadar falan. Sen şey almıyordun değil mi? Yoksa geçen dönem aldım. Orada kardeşim var mı? Sen soracaksın. Yani bir şey soracağım aslında. Ben mi kaçırdım bir şey?
Hey. You got over the dog thing.
Yeah, I just got my
Sticks.
so, yeah.
So they're more relaxed now.
Yes.
I'm good. Ali Jan is teething very badly. So his teeth are coming through. So like this tonight, up until this week, he's been very easy baby. But now his teeth are really hurting. And so he woke up at 4 o'clock and he cries unless you hold him. So, you know, if you're not just holding him sitting down, but you have to walk around with him. Yeah. And so it's just like, I want to sleep. Yeah, so he's quite difficult at the moment.
I hope he will get better soon.
It's just the teeth coming through. Yeah. But it's so sad because he's so sweet normally and so cute. Yeah, it's very difficult. And this is the first time he's been really crying a lot. Okay, shall we? I mean, where is everyone? So let's start with Bayesian fundamentalism. So
do you genuinely believe that some numbers are innate? Or is just that empirical evidence supports that such as that kind of view?
well, I mean, you might think that to understand the number one, you only really understand the number one once you've understood all of the numbers. So you might think you don't really have an understanding of 1, 2, and 3 without an understanding of 10 or 11. Yeah. And I think that's sort of true. I think there's one sense of, so once again, I think it's a sort of a question, a stipulative question of what do you mean by having the concept 1? Now, in one sense, you might think you've only got the concept 1, 2, and 3 when you've got all the numbers, once you've understood all the numerals. So yeah, the chimpanzee doesn't have an understanding of one as a numeral. The chimpanzee, though, can distinguish between sets of cardinality 1 and sets of cardinality 2.
Yeah. Question was, I mean, I'm trying to figure out everything in entire representation terms.
Yeah.
So this is a high representation viewpoint.
Yeah.
So I just want to try to figure out a little.
Yeah. So one thing you might think is that you've got sets of cardinality 1, sets of cardinality 2, sets of cardinality 3. Now, I mean, if you're doing analytic metaphysics, you could imagine a being that kind of had names for each of these sets, but without having anything like the successor function. Now, it seems to me that understanding numbers involves understanding the successor function, and not just having names for sets of various cardinalities. Yeah. So you can think of at some point you might have names for sets of various cardinalities. So you kind of, I said singleton, a pair, triple. Yeah. Now you might have these names. The names of a singleton, a pair, and a triple. And if someone has acquired these names, have they got the numbers 1, 2, and 3? And I think not, because I think it makes sense to say, well, having the concept 1 involves understanding the successor function. And so having a grasp of numbers involves not just having names for the set sizes, but that one of the essential things about 2, you may learn a pair of socks. So a child may learn without learning the counting list. They may have a word for a singleton. They may have a word for a pair. So give me a pair of socks. Give me a pair of beers. Give me And you might think you have the word for a singleton and a word for a pair. Some languages, this is built into the grammar. You have single.
Some languages you have the dual.
Dual, yeah. And you might think learning the dual, the grammatical dual, you can learn that without having the concept 2. You've got something that is connected to the concept, is going to be part of the concept 2, because having the concept 2 involves being able to recognize pairs as pairs. So you might think that having this capacity is going to be a necessary condition for having the capacity to have the concept 2, but it's not sufficient, because you can have this without having anything like a successor function, without having any sort of idea of add 1. Yeah.
Do you think that there might be a Newtonian process where children come to discriminate between those sets of cardinality without representing anything innately? Like to such.
So one thing is that so these sort of capacities, you may think you could explain them without in non-representationalist terms. Yeah. So these analog representations and the tracking stuff, because what you've got are just capacities. Here you've got a capacity to track single things, as opposed to a capacity to track a pair, as opposed to a capacity to track a triple. And these are kind of tracking capacities, you might think. And I think a non-representationalist is going to be fine with capacities to track things. Yeah. And then you might think this sort of stuff, having the numbers, involves external systems. Yeah. So, and I think anti-representationalists, most of them are happy with the idea that language is representation. Not all anti-representationists. So there's a guy, what's it called? Belgian guy, who thinks that what's a non-representationalist view of language. Who's that conference I think he's dropped out of philosophy. He's got a bunch of publications. He talks about wording. He thinks that there aren't sentences. Because there are utterances and wordings, and typing these wordings is really hard. but you have this sort of external, yeah, so you might be an anti-representationalist when it comes to psychology. I think language is representational, and then we acquire adult number concepts by acquiring number language. We got number language tied to capacities, kind of recognized, you know, I think you could say a lot of this without being committed to a sort of strongly representationalist psychology. Okay, so that's, any other questions about Kerry? I think Kerry's book's quite fun. This Dehani book on the number sense is fun. I think both of them are books that are fun if you're a psychologist. They're sort of classic, and I think they're also fun if you're a philosopher. Yeah, both of them, I think, are fairly sophisticated. So, Bayesianism. So who's come across Bayesianism before? Yeah, so who's a psychologist or a linguist? Have you come across it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So who hasn't come across it? Philosopher? Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, have you come across Bayesianism? You know what Bayesian? Yeah. Yeah. So Bayesianism is, if you're in psychology, well, I guess if you're in linguistics, anyone who you come across Bayesian models in? Yeah, so I mean, in both psychology and linguistics, Bayesianism has become a very big sort of thing. And Bayesianism is just a bit of maths. Yeah, so it's just a bit of maths about probability. Yeah, so and the basic idea in Bayesianism is really quite simple. It's not scary at all. Yeah. It turns out that once you get complicated environments, then the maths gets very messy. Yeah, so it gets very messy very quickly, and you know, there's lots of the maths can get quite hard. But actually, the basic idea is such that you can understand what the maths is doing and why there might be a problem with it without really worrying about the complexity of the models. Yeah. So what is Bayesianism? So Bayesianism works like this. You've got a bunch of the ways the world could be. Now, so let's say there's four different ways. There's four different ways the world could be. Yeah. Bayesianism tells you start off with a prior probability distribution. So you start off with, let's say it's 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25. Yeah. Then Bayesianism tells you how to update your hypotheses, how to update the likelihood, how to update the probability distribution on the basis of new evidence. Yeah. So you've got a bunch of hypotheses, yeah, and then you make an observation. Yeah. And Bayesianism tells you, the Bayesian stuff tells you how to update the probability distribution on the basis of new evidence. Yeah. So you have new evidence, which leads to a sort of updating. Yeah. And the way that there's Bayes' law, which actually I had it on my phone, because they don't actually state it very clearly here, that tells you how to do it. Let me not tell you the law yet, yeah, because it's on my phone. I forgot the details. I would get it wrong if I try and do it from memory. Yeah, but let me just say one thing. Okay, well, where is the law? Why don't I just write it down? Oops. So I just put it on my phone. Yeah. So what is it? The probability of A given B. So this is kind of one of the hypotheses. This is the new evidence. Yeah, equals the probability of B given A times the probability of A times the probability of B. So now these are the priors. Yeah, so you've got some prior understanding what is the probability of A. Yeah, and then this is known as the likelihood. How do you spell likelihood? Likelihood. Yeah, and the prior and the likelihood are taken as somehow given. These are things that kind of, in some sense, you can assume you can know. If you know the prior, if you've got some reasonable prior and some reasonable likelihood, then Bayes' law tells you what's the rational way to update your prior. Yeah. Now, I think the best way of looking at this, so one thing is like hello people out there, are you still there? I was just doing all sorts of, hello? Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think the best way of looking at this is in terms of an example. But I think the important thing that what Bayes tells you, what this tells you is if you know this, if you know the prior and the likelihood, the Bayesian law tells you what is rational to end up believing. Yeah, so given the prior and the likelihood, how should one change one's judgment about a particular hypothesis based on the new evidence? And what Bayes' law tells you is what's rational to do. Yeah, we've got an idea of given these two things, if these are somehow given, what is the rational thing to do on the basis of new evidence? And so we have some notion of sort of Bayesian optimality. Bayesian optimality is what a fully rational agent would do. How would a rational agent, how would a rational agent change their hypothesis, change their judgment on the basis of new evidence? Yeah. And a lot of people in Bayesian, these sort of Bayesian modeling, start off with the idea that human beings are rational. Yeah, that we've evolved to be Bayesian optimal. Yeah, we've evolved in such a way that we're likely to update our judgment rationally on the basis of evidence. And what Bayes' law tells us is the rational way of updating one's judgment on the basis of evidence. Now, the thing about most of these Bayesian models is where do we get the prior from and the likelihood functions? Where do these come from? And what's the answer? So those of you who have come across Bayesian, where you get likelihood functions in the priors from past experience? Well,
Some might argue that priors are innate.
now, aren't these supposed to be subjective?
Possible alternatives.
Well, I take it the sort of standard view is that the prior and the likelihood are going to be facts about the environment. Yeah, that it's the environment, given the environment, the facts about the prior and the likelihood are ultimately going to be facts that aren't mental. They're going to be facts about the environment.
You're not talking about Bayesian perception, right? You're talking about Bayesian conclusions that not necessarily apply to perception. Because as I know, in Bayesian perception, priors and likelihoods are based on past experience. I mean, if then it's applied to perception. I don't think Bayesian perception kind of implies that we are objectively aware of.
Well, so like, of course, that you've got a prior on the basis of your experience. You change your prior, and so this is the prior, this is the posterior. Yeah, but so if you go through continuous updating, yeah, that in the second round, the prior now is the posterior of the previous experience. Yeah, so when it comes to experience, yeah, we're always updating our prior. Yeah, but in the Bayesian model, when you model this, you have to start off with some prior that isn't the result of experience. Yeah, but then through multiple experiences, you end up with a sort of the prior changes on the basis of experience. Now that's obviously right. But when you have your model, the original, the prior, when you're modeling this, the prior somehow, the prior that you start off with in your model is one that you just have to stipulate. And the idea is that the way to do this is in terms of the way things are distributed in the environment. Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't that make it a bit ad hoc?
This is the problem. Yeah. So when you come up with your model, you first of all have to give it a prior, but also these likelihood functions as well. Now, I mean, my sense is that the likelihood functions is a given. I mean, you may have hierarchical systems where the upper level things can change the likelihoods of the lower level ones. Yeah, but you have to start off with some sort of likelihood function, and that's also something you just start off with as a sort of that the experimenter starts off with as a given. And I take it the idea is that so the first prior, and this is the initial likelihood function, are supposed to capture something about the way in which the problem, just what Bayes gives you is an account of rationality. Yeah, and it gives you an account of what the optimal type of decision is. Yeah, so you start off with, like, suppose the likelihoods are like this and the prior is like this. What would be the rational decision to arrive at? Yeah, so what the Bayesian model is giving you is an account of what an optimal Bayesian rational judger would come up with. Yeah, and so in order to do that, you don't need any information about internal processing. You just start off with a description of the environment. Yeah, and you say, given this distribution and this likelihood distribution, what would be the optimal thing to do? And that's what the Bayesian models tell you. And then the sort of idea is that, look, these human subjects are making judgments that are close to what we judge to be optimal. Yeah, therefore, we've got a model of what's going on. Because what they're doing is they're choosing the Bayesian optimal result. Yeah. So I take it the models. Yeah, this is where, I mean, for those of you in psychology, this is why I think it's interesting, because the section on Bayes is the new behaviorism. Yeah, that these models basically, you go from the structure of the environment, you have a bunch of maths, so you have the structure of the environment. And then you have a bunch of maths that tells you what would be the optimal way to make judgments given this evidence, given this structure. So you have an account of optimality. And then you say, and then we have these human subjects, and they are, in some sense, acting in a way that appears to be optimal, given these assumptions about the initial priors and the likelihood function. Now, they give a bunch of, so maybe that, I mean, so you should read this and you should decide, maybe there are some people using Bayesian psychology who are starting off with subjective stuff. But I take it that the appeals to Bayesian optimality, those who are kind of, first of all, working out what's Bayesian optimal, are starting off, they have to start off with some sort of likelihood function, some sort of priors. And the way you do that is the way you can do this is just by looking at the structure of the environment. Yeah. So let's have a look at, what time is it now? 37. So on page, okay. So on page 173, he gives a little summary of how Bayesianism works. So for those of you who've never come across Bayes, I think it's worth looking at. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. And then in section 4, he talks about Bayes as the new behaviorism. Yeah. And I think that for the psychologists, this is the bit to read and to think about, is this right? When you look at Bayesian models, is this fair? So this paper is from Brain and Behavioral Sciences. And BBS, you first of all have the target article, and then you have a lot of people disagreeing and talking shit and arguing. And I think there was quite a lively debate here. And they're being very polite, but basically they're saying these basic models are sort of ad hoc, and the math is so powerful that if you put in the right assumptions, you can make any sort of thing come out as rational. And it just has to do with what sort of likelihoods and priors you stick in there. Yeah. And then the idea is that the likelihoods and priors are supposed to reflect something about the structure of the environment. Yeah. So given the structure of the environment might give you some sort of likelihood and priors. But most of the people who are doing this Bayesian stuff make gestures about the kind of the reasonableness of the likelihood function and the priors. Yeah. But they don't offer any justification for it. There are some Bayesians who he thinks do a slightly better job. And these are the people who do sort of natural landscape processing in vision. And there, they actually go out there and start off very explicitly by, they're looking at kind of contour detection. They start off with the sort of what they take to be the evolutionary environment rather than the modern urban environment. Yeah, and then they look at the likelihood of two edges being connected. in these photons. So they kind of try and give an objective likelihood function based upon some sort of natural environment. Yeah, and so and I think they think that this is sort of the way to go. But even there, that the hypothesis formation is too under constrained, and so the problem, I take it, the problem with Bayesian models is, first of all, there's no emphasis on mechanism. Yeah, first of all. Secondly, all they do is existence proofs on the whole. So they just say, oh, there's a way of taking this sort of behavior and using this maths. Here's one way of describing it as optimal. Yeah, so they just do an existence proof. Here's one Bayesian model that gets you behavior similar to this. So it's possible to have a Bayesian, it's possible to see this as Bayesian optimal. But you might think, well, what we want is we want a whole bunch of different hypotheses, and we want to find out which one's more likely. And so the sort of main claims is that Bayesian fundamentalism is ad hoc. Yeah, the models are sort of ad hoc, and they're hopelessly ad hoc. I think they're not hard enough. Yeah, yeah. And secondly, that they're because they're unconstrained, and there is no account of mechanism. Yeah, so from the sort of perspective of Ma, Bayesian models are at the kind of computational level. Yeah, they're not at the algorithmic level or the. Yeah. Okay.
I was going to ask something else
Okay.
related to this. I don't know whether the authors mentioned this in the paper or not, but they apply to neuroscience. Bayesian models have some implications, like individual neurons, or a couple of them are good at maths and probability and all.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So, I mean, they're looking at Bayesian models in psychology. Yeah, not so much Bayesian models in neuroscience. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, I'm not sure whether these sort of models are. So one thing about Bayesian models that I think is sort of important is what you're getting is something at the computational level. Yeah, you've got some evidence. Yeah, you've got some new evidence. And what the Bayesian model does is basically gives you a kind of function from the new evidence to a kind of update, and it tells you what's the rational way to update your hypothesis space given new evidence. Yeah, your probability distribution given new evidence. Yeah, so you have a function. I take it from new evidence to some sort of updating. Yeah, and it doesn't say anything about the sort of algorithms that are used or the processes that are used in doing this. Yeah, so Bayesian accounts don't give you, or at least the simple Bayesian accounts don't give you anything to do with algorithms.
There's some theories implemented.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
so one thing is there are algorithms. So it turns out that once you've got a complex hypothesis space, then it turns out that the maths is intractable. And then you have algorithms that are used by the mathematicians to solve the problem. Yeah, but I don't think it's not obvious that you think, well, these algorithms supposed to then be being used by the brain. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it seems to me that's not how the Bayesian, that these sort of algorithms are just useful ways of finding out what's Bayesian optimal in a certain situation, without any suggestion that these are supposed to underlie the way that we do it. So these are at the computational level. Now, next week, we're going to finish off talking about this, but we're also going to look at this paper on the predictive mind. And I take it the predictive mind stuff is Bayesian. It's got a certain type of hierarchical attack. And it seems to me that it does offer, so I think the predictive mind stuff kind of it does suffer from some of these problems, but it does offer more specificality. So I think there's going to be a connection between the predictive mind stuff and how the brain works. So one thing about the predictive mind stuff is you have a bunch of levels, yeah, where you have, you have predictions being sent down and then error reports being sent forward. And these sort of models involve dividing things up into a number of different levels like this. And you have levels of prediction and error reports. And so I think in some sense, you might think, well, that there is a way of seeing how this could map on to something mechanistic, because you might think that what's going on in the brain is predictions being sent out, error reports being sent forward. Yeah, prediction errors being sent forward, and that the sort of way Bayesianism is used in the predictive mind seems to tie to something that might be thought of as semi-mechanistic. Because you've got, it says that you're going to get some sort of functional differentiation. Yeah, and you might then use this as a way of searching for different bits of the brain fulfilling these different functions. But I think, yeah, so one thing is what you're getting is something purely at the computational level of the description. Yeah.
Then again, there remains the next to recap why brain use Bayesian probability to show all that stuff. How or I mean,
Yeah. So
we can't reduce that to a more low level.
Yeah. So I think the story does the brain use. So according to the Bayesianism they don't like, the brain doesn't use any of this Bayesian stuff, because what the brain does is approximates Bayesian optimality. Yeah, so you've got some account of what's Bayesian optimal, and then the sort of the story is that the brain has evolved in such a way that it approximates or this optimal solution. But the Bayesian account doesn't tell you how the brain does it. Yeah.
So there's no explanation. It's just a description of. I mean, it's self-explanatory. It's something to be explained in that.
Yeah. So and then you might think, oh, maybe that's intractable. Yeah. But yeah. So yeah. But the idea is though that what Bayes gives you is an account of what's optimal, what's rational. Yeah. So you have Bayesian optimal. It's a sort of rationalistic account. It says that what the math tells you is what's the rational way, what's the best way to update your kind of judgment on the basis of new evidence. And then what the math gives you is an account of what's optimal, Bayesian optimality. And then the idea is that the brain somehow is acting in a way that is sort of optimal, or it's acting, if you, and often I think that this Bayesianism is sort of tied, makes certain assumptions that it shares with evolutionary psychology. So there's, after talking about Bayes and behaviorism, they also talk about Bayesianism and evolutionary psychology. And yeah, I take it the sort of thought is that we've sort of evolved to approximate Bayesian optimality. This is the sort of assumption lying behind this. And I think these sort of optimality assumptions are really impossible. So the idea that we're going to be Bayesian optimal. So one thing about, if you're thinking about evolution, you might think evolution is a sort of, you can think of it as something like a search for optimality. And those creatures that are non-optimal are going to lose the fight. So there's some sort of pressure for optimality. But one thing about, so you might think, let's suppose being optimal is being at the bottom of a slope. But you might think that, like, I mean, if everyone's here, there's going to be pressure to get down here. Yeah. evolution is likely, and development is likely to get you to a local optima. It's going to get you to something that's locally optimal. That if you get to here and everyone else is around here, yeah, then you're going to be doing better than anyone else. But actually, there's going to be pressure for here, and actually, like kind of, there's another thing over here, yeah, which is even more optimal, yeah. So I think one thing about optimalization is that the idea that evolution is going to push us towards something like a global optimal solution just seems unlikely. Yeah, that we're going to there's going to be some pressure towards local optima, but then of course as the environment's always changing. What's optimal changes, like as you develop, your predator's going to develop, and so the kind of the space of what's optimal is always changing over time as well. So the sort of idea that evolution is going to act such that we're going to be Bayesian optimal seems a very plausible claim about evolution. This is the sort of assumption. So the Bayesian picture gives us an account of what would be optimal, yeah, given the likelihood of the prior. Now, why don't you? So most of you haven't read this, and why don't you read for next class section 3? For those of you who've never come across Bayesianism, it's a little summary. That there's an example of the fan entering the football stadium, yeah, which I think gives a nice, kind of easy to think about little example of how Bayesianism works. And then there's section 4 of Bayes as the new behaviorism. And I think for those of you in psychology, this is useful to think about. Is this right? Is this what's going on in the Bayesian account? Do they deny mechanism? The Bayesianism seems, as a theory of psychology, the sort of idea is it seems remarkably unpsychological, because basically what it's calculating is what an ideal agent would do. And I do think that the sort of the likelihood and the prior are in some sense supposed to be out there in the environment. They're not there, because if they're not out there in the environment, then you don't have an idea of an ideal agent. Yeah, there are the likelihoods. Yeah, the thing about Bayesianism is that the sort of idea is regardless of your prior, if you carry on updating, you're slowly going to converge on the truth. Now, it's not fully true, because if you have an absolutely crazy prior, you can never sort of get it. But for a large range of priors, the idea, it doesn't really matter what you start off with. If you kind of update on the basis of new evidence, you're going to converge, or you're going to get, probably, unless your priors are too crazy, like you may have QAnon priors, in which case you're never going to get anywhere, but as long as your likelihood functions are somehow based on reality, yeah, if your likelihood functions are just random, then you're not going to be optimal in any way. So the likelihood functions have to have some sort of basis in the environment. I think that's where the Bayesians are sort of coming from. Yeah, so if you're from psychology, think about some of the Bayesian stuff you've looked at, and think about, is this characterization of this stuff fair? Are these people fairly presenting the Bayesian position, or is there a more plausible way of presenting it? So we're going to look at this Bayesian stuff, and then we're going to look at this predictive mind stuff. And the predictive mind stuff, I think, also appeals to this idea of optimality. So there's and the predictive mind stuff. Anyone doing Tristan? Yeah. So yeah, that's a bit difficult. But there's a little talk about Tristan there, but he's very interesting. So he thinks that the mathematics of the sort of predictive mind stuff is sort of equivalent to this free energy principle. And so that living systems have evolved to, what is it? Minimize entropy. Yeah, this is kind of, and once again, there's this idea of optimality, which I think is also implausible. Yeah, the idea that that living systems, in some sense, and their search find a sort of global optimum seems implausible. In order to do well in evolution, you don't have to be the best; you just have to be better than your neighbors. Yeah, that's the sort of idea. That you don't have to find the best solution. You just have to find a solution that's better than the one that your neighbors have found. And it may be that, and also sort of evolution is path dependent. Yeah, so once you've developed a certain sort of spine, yeah, and then you learn to stand upwards. The spine we have developed, first of all, that's why we sort of get backaches. Yeah, like our body, the evolution is sort of path dependent. And I think this is something that Bayesians don't really take account of. Yeah, that because they don't focus on mechanisms. You might think, well, if you've got mechanisms, then what's going to be selected over are not behaviors but mechanisms. Yeah, the Bayesians seem to assume that what's being selected over are sort of behaviors. That the evolution searches for the best behaviors. Yeah. Whereas it seems that if you're going to have any sort of evolutionary field psychology, what's being selected for are the sort of mechanisms that lead to behavior, and you're going to end up with a path dependency, which is going to mean that you're not going to be Bayesian optimal. Yeah, because the path you take is going to partially determine. Yeah, so I sort of buy into their criticisms of these sort of Bayesian models. And I think the biggest problems are going to be the ad hocness. For anyone who's taken a class with Uz, because he talked about, his PhD was a lot about ad hocness. Is he still talking about ad hocness? Yeah, so Bayesianism, ad hoc. Ask us, what type of ad hocness is it? Because how many ad hocnesses has he got now? Last time I checked, it's about 4. Yeah, maybe he's got 5 or 6 different types of ad hocness by now. Yeah. And so, yeah, by playing around with the likelihoods and the priors, you're able to make any sort of behavior seem rational. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's finish. We say a bit early, or? Oh, I went on too long. Okay. So, and I've started grading